All rise, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. It's your host once again, Derek Caldwell, and I'm with author and speaker Abdu Murray. Abdu, how are you?
I'm well, Derek. How are you doing?
Good. I like to start off these episodes sometimes with I literally will just think, what did we just talk about? And then I try to embarrass you on the show because people have, they might have a lofty opinion of what a Christian thinker may be thinking about at any one moment. But I brought you in some cat toys today, and I was just wondering if you would like to explain that to people of why you've suddenly gotten into collecting cat toys.
Well, collecting them is a bit of a strong word, but I am enjoying them because I'm watching my mom's cat. And I have, knowing that I'm normally not a pet person, but I have fallen in love with this cat. She is going back. Zelda, the Legend of Zelda, will be going back to my mom soon. But I've fallen in love with playing with this cat, and you were kind enough to bring me in a number of things, including the laser pointer, which will provide the cat and me endless amounts of joy. So thanks for that, and thanks for outing me. Appreciate it. Thanks.
I know there's a real reversal too. You play with the cat, they expend energy, you expend none, and normally it's the other way around. You do everything for them, and they do nothing. So it's a great reversal of fortunes. But that's the frivolous stuff. We've actually got a really good guest today to get to, who I apologize for having made sit through that. But today we are joined by Michael Ware, who is he's a thought leader at the intersection of faith and public life. This is the part where we embarrass Michael. Known for promoting this vision of politics shaped by spiritual formation and Christian values. He's the founder and president of a wonderful organization, a nonprofit in Washington, D.C. called the Center for Christianity and Public Life, which Abdu, you were able to attend the inaugural event for. And yeah, this nonpartisan group that's sort of aimed at this, making Christian perspectives credible and constructive in public discourse. And he's written a couple of books, including Reclaiming Hope, Lessons Learned in the Obama White House about the Future of Faith in America. And this one, The Spirit of Our Politics, Spiritual Formation and the Renovation of Public Life, which we've got right here. Excellent book. I've had the joy of going through that. And and he served in the Obama administration, actually, as a key advisor on faith-based initiatives and outreach. So he's been there in Washington. And so we are so happy to have him here today to talk about being a Christian in Washington, D.C., and being very, very faithful in that realm. So, Michael, it's awesome to have you here.
So good to be with you. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Well, Michael, I want to just jump in with a question that I wouldn't have you on the show for a number of reasons, but I do have a primary reason, and so I'm going to put my cards on the table right up front. And it's this. There's a phenomenon in America, I think it's probably global, but I think it's pointed here in America, that two people can have the same party affiliation, the same political affiliation, and have vastly different faith traditions. And some of those things can be vastly or diametrically opposed to each other in terms of their dogmas and these kind of things. But the people who have the same political affiliation and different faiths can be friends, and everything's fine. But people can share the same faith tradition, and in fact, not only just share it in name only, but actually deeply convicted in sharing the same faith tradition, but have different party affiliations, and there's animus and distrust and an expectation to sort of vanquish your enemies. I find that to be odd and distressing. So same party, different faiths, we're fine. Same faith, different parties, and we're enemies. I'd love for you to comment on that, because you and I share the same faith. You and me and Derek all share the same faith traditions and the same commitment, I think, level, hopefully, to that faith tradition. It's a very tough thing to navigate. So I'm going to stop talking about that. That's my question.
Yeah.
I'd love for you to comment on that phenomenon.
Well, I've observed this too. And there are many ways of talking about this, but I think the primary question is, what dominates your imagination? The liberalism suggests that what really matters are your ideological opinions, not religion. I mean, in many ways, liberalism is intended to, at least in the political realm, although often the logic of liberalism gets extended then throughout the society, suggest that actually not just religion, but other distinctions don't really count, don't really matter. And in some ways, right, like that in the political context, you want to be able to find commonality and find common purpose with people who are different. I think one of the issues, though, is if we aren't careful as Christians, we think that political reality is actually the ultimate reality.
Right.
And so the question is, like, what do you think really matters? Is politics where the real work is done? Is politics the ultimate sort of actor in the world? And then maybe our faith is just something that is maybe a personal comfort, maybe something we lean on in hard times, but really doesn't constitute a publicly available reality. Then yeah, you know, if we're of different faiths, what does that really matter? But different politics, well, you're trying you're trying to advance something that puts at risk and threatens where I find my ultimate security and identity. And that's what we have a lot of. Politics is causing spiritual harm in Americans' lives. And a big reason for that is many Americans are going to politics to get their spiritual needs met. And when that is what we're going to politics for, we're in some real trouble.
Yeah, as you're speaking, it just and you've written quite a bit in terms of spiritual formation and other things. To talk about that so deeply, I think it's important is that politics is no longer an extension of one's worldview. It is their worldview, as opposed to faith, which is something that forms your worldview, and then politics becomes an extension of that worldview, or an expression, I should say, not even an extension. Extension is too strong a word. It should be an expression of it, but one of the many expressions we have in our lives. It's not the end-all, be-all, but it is something really important in terms of our expressions of our worldview. That reminds me, real quick before we move on, it is, you know, when I was doing some of my writing relatively recently, and I was talking about race and sexism and the Bible and these kind of issues. One of the things that comes up frequently in terms of the expression of faith as a worldview, as it extends out into social issues and political issues, is what was called the miracle motif. And it was a way in which we deride various evangelistic efforts by saying, okay, look, if we all just preach the gospel, that's all we do is preach the gospel, then everyone would sort of line up with Jesus's ideals, and we would end racism, we would end sexism, we would end every other thing that ends in ism or phobia, and we'd all just get along and all that stuff. And it's been derided as the miracle motif. And the fact that we could have the same faith and different parties and yet not agree and even become enemies kind of shows that the miracle motif criticism is right. It's like, guys, if you're just thinking you believe the same things but don't live the same thing, you're going to have disagreement. Yeah. So anyway, I think that was something you were saying. So anyway, feel free to comment on that.
No, just like, so one of the ways that this shows up, and it's very interesting, and you might remember from my organization's first summit, we had Bryant Wright. Bryant Wright is was head of the Southern Baptist Convention, now is head of Send Relief, which is a humanitarian arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. And, you know, he was speaking in part on immigration. Now, if you look at Southern Baptists, how they vote, and think just from that political sort of analysis, you're going to know what Bryant Wright has to say about immigration. You're going to think one thing. And depending on what you think about politics, you may even be right about that assessment in terms of his political views on the subject. But you might think that nothing else matters. But what's interesting, but this is a live debate. There are people who think that the fact that you have people who would welcome refugees into their home, that would give money for resettlement efforts, that would provide that would welcome refugees into their church and provide aid, emotional, financial, all kinds of aid. There are people in our society right now who think that those things don't matter if you don't vote the way that they would want. And what I would say is like that's a totally it's not that your vote doesn't matter, but your vote, the influence of your vote is so diffused. Like the political influence that an individual person actually has is so diffused and shared that I think if you asked any refugee, if you asked anyone facing injustice, if they had to choose between someone who quote unquote voted the right way and someone who was actually a tangible support to them in the midst of their communities and their lives, like that's not a debate for those facing injustice. It is a debate for those who watch politics as entertainment. And say, you know, like, so we worry so much about the misalignment between one's personal values and their politics, but we worry about it only from one direction, many of us, which is, you know, because your politics doesn't line up with my conception of your personal values don't matter. What I would say is we need to think much more clearly about why aren't your politics reflected in the way you actually live your life? Why do we have so many people who are willing to berate others about how righteous their political views are, but then you look at how they actually live their lives and their own lives don't match their politics? So this is like a really, just quickly, I think one of the answers for this, of course, is it costs something to be personally invested in a way that posting on social media and putting a yard sign out doesn't cost. That has a representational value, but it doesn't require real sacrifice in many cases. And so these are some of the distinctions that I think are helpful for us to think about.
Well, just one other thing to seize on what you just said, I think it's important, is politics as entertainment often creates this sense, this ability, even in well-informed people. And well-informed doesn't mean that you watch a lot of television,
right,
or even read a lot of stuff. It means, you know, certainly well-orbed in looking at the entirety of something's case. Politics as entertainment destroys nuance.
Yes.
And it destroys the ability to nuance a person. So I'll bet there are people who are watching this or listening to this on the podcast who can tell me of conversations that they've had with people who share the same faith tradition, who they know have certain views on certain things politically, but act in a way that's not inconsistent in a bad way, but is surprising. So let's say someone does take in lots of refugees or contributes to refugee causes and cares a lot about the way in which the sojourner and the stranger is treated in America, but voted for Trump because of Kamala Harris's border policy.
Right.
It's like, whoa, wait a minute. How those? Well, there's a nuance. You can vote because you're like, I think this is a bad way to handle this. Here's a better way to handle it. Or I didn't vote because of that reason. I voted because of another reason altogether, because it's multifaceted. But we have this caricature of a person based on how they voted because of politics as entertainment, which I actually equate to not just entertainment, like can I watch which talking head wins on the CNN panel, but it's more of Roman gladiatorial fights. It's no longer a civil public square. It's the gladiator arena. And by the way, and everyone, not just, you know, the conservative talking head or the liberal talking head, it's everyone now is a gladiator. And the crowd is almost entirely made up of gladiators.
Right.
So anyway, that's kind of how I see it.
Yeah.
So as you were talking about that, one of the things that sort of occurred to me there then too is the again we get back into that issue of, I think, allegiances, and you have this in and that's kind of how we started this conversation. So on page 15 of your book, you wrote this. You said, positive service-oriented approaches to politics are possible in this environment. But when we see people who approach politics this way, we are surprised. We are suspicious. We view these people as impossibly heroic or hopelessly naive. The true public servant is viewed in a way that is not all that dissimilar from the saint. And then you at the end of your chapter on gentleness, you give you talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who's very much in the news right now because his there's a new movie about him, and there's debate over even that movie, and it is kind of along political lines, and all of that. But you really, I think, in the book, you do a great job of focusing on essentially what type of person do you want to be, and sort of get your politics being guided by these convictions. But what I was interested, just as a fan of Bonhoeffer, and you point him out. You also obviously the sort of the spirit of Dallas Willard is obviously very big in your book as well. I know he was a big impact on you. But what is it that you find in, versus all the versions of Bonhoeffer we can hear about right now? What is it you find there as like, because I've always found Bonhoeffer's example very approachable as a, even though he is this sort of saintly figure, but the more you read about the real man, he does become much more approachable as this example of, okay, here's someone who can reach across the aisle, or really have a hand in both aisles, or not both aisles, but on both sides of the aisle, and sort of live faithfully in that. And it's all about how he was formed sort of in this image of Christ thing. And so what do you find in his example, and even as just thinking of a way forward?
Friends, this is a listener and viewer supported program. Whether you're listening on the podcast or you're watching this on YouTube, the only way we can do this is by the support of good friends like you who want to see this kind of content and be able to share it with other people. So if this is content you value, please not only subscribe, not only share the content, not only rate the podcast, but do consider giving a donation. You can do this in the U.S. and Canada. You can go to our website, embracethetruth.org. There's some buttons there that help you to find ways to give to us. And the link is in the description as well. So we thank you for your support. God bless.
Well, so, I often, so in this chapter on gentleness, I close talking about maybe 2.5 pages from Life Together, Bonhoeffer's book, Life Together. And I honestly, like, in terms of images and ideas that could transform Christian public presence, I think if people only came away with one thing, it would be this idea, which is Bonhoeffer says this remarkable thing in Life Together. He says Christians never meet one-on-one. Their meetings are always mediated by Jesus. They are preceded by Jesus. Jesus goes before them. He is between them. And he says, so when I am meeting with a fellow Christian, I am not seeking to impose my agenda on them. I am not trying to affect my will on them. I am looking to Jesus and seeking what he is doing, what his agenda is, and how I could. He says this amazing thing. He says, a Christian will speak more to Christ about his brother than to the brother about Christ. I think that's like an extraordinary statement. Now, of course, Bonhoeffer has particular application for that, and I think it's important to be attentive to the theological reality, like the metaphysical reality that he is. He isn't just suggesting this is a nice idea. He's talking about the living Jesus being in our midst.
Right.
What I just try to explore and provide imagination for is, what if Christians approached public life with the idea that they were doing so not as an act of imposition on others, but as Willard said, referring to apologetics generally, it's a helping ministry. You approach people in a spirit of loving service. What would happen if we approached our public life as something that was mediated by Jesus, as something where Jesus was preceding us, that our chief aim was not to advance our self-interest or even like our autonomous will? What would that do to the Christian public presence? Because I'll tell you, when many Americans see Christians gathering for worldview conferences or public political advocacy conferences, they do not look at those gatherings and say, well, there's a bunch of people who are seeking my good. And that is not the message. Many Americans look at those gatherings and go, there is one more special interest group that is seeking to get its way in our political life, usually over and above everyone else's way. So that idea from Bonhoeffer is just so rich and powerful to me, and I'm usually not a visual thinker. I wanted to offer that in the book, especially for those who are, and it's captured my imagination as well. As opposed to our politics being this area of life that's cordoned off from God, what if we could actually approach our political life with Jesus?
Mhm. Yeah. Well, and Bonhoeffer had this great when he came to America, one of the things he had an issue with was he noticed everyone's been so influenced by this pragmatism thing, and this was one of his major beefs with just American people and American Christianity in general. But you see that is part of what has sort of seeped in. It's the expediency, and this is how you win debates. This is how you beat your political opponent. This is how, towards the end. No, I wish I would have. I don't know if I put this in here, but towards the end of the book, you give all these basically these political these myths of how you have to act in in the political realm. You have to use fear, you have to be antagonistic, and all of that. But it really does say that
vulgarity. You have to be vulgar. You have to be angry.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's the entertainment part, because you have to win a fight. This is Abdu. We mentioned it on the episode with John Stone Street, but it has become pro wrestling is what this is. So, and we're trying to win arguments rather than people. We're trying to win arguments rather than help people.
Yeah.
So the spiritual formation part of that is because you have to come from a strong base, because the inherent sort of within the human person, this inherent desire to not necessarily desired, but this natural impulse to divide. There was this book by Max Fisher called The Chaos Machine, talking about algorithms and Facebook, and he said, one of these studies that Facebook did and then ended up ignoring because it didn't go their way was they found that the algorithm sort of exacerbated the sort of the human sort of natural inclination to divide. And so it takes a strong person from a strong base to really be able to fight that, because it does seem very, to sort of go back, and something you both have talked about is the sickness in politics. And we've talked about it a bit from, it definitely appears very sick right now. And Michael, you talked about it from the perspective of there's something inherently sick about it. You referred to it as this sort of leukemia sort of thing, that we actually need this marrow transplant. It's not appendicitis where it's just there's a problem and you can take it out. It's something deeply within us. Where does that come from? And is there a way to override the human, at least in the fallen human nature, to really, because that's where I think some people may have issues with the hope for the future, is it's this particular issue. We seem so bent on dividing and fighting. When was it ever better? Why is it like this now? Those sorts of questions.
Yeah. So one of the ways I try to put some context and definition around our political sickness is through this concept, this framework of political sectarianism. And political sectarianism is a way of defining the features of the particular kind of polarization we have today. And one of the reasons I like it is that it's not a historical comparison. I actually think like you can get into some really like just weird and bad arguments, but are we more polarized than ever? I guess that's interesting in an academic setting. I think most of us are just like, how do we deal with reality as it is now? Like you know, like what is facing us? And the particular kind of polarization we face today, what these social scientists call political sectarianism, is upheld by three pillars. The tendency of aversion, which is the tendency to dislike and distrust those who disagree with you politically. The tendency of othering, which is a tendency to sort of place outside of the bounds of typical human community those who disagree with you politically. And then finally, the tendency of moralization, or what I call a misplaced moralization. And interestingly, these social scientists said the tendency of moralization is a tendency to elevate political disagreement to the level of iniquity. They use the term iniquity, that it's not just about being right or wrong, but about good and evil. And this toxic cocktail has had profound influence on political dysfunction and driving political dysfunction. But what the social scientists are also clear about is the way that this has seeped into the actual lives that we live and lead. So a lot of people think about polarization as like something that happens at our state capitals and in Congress. But what's become really clear over the last decade in particular is that this polarization, well, so a lot of people argue that it's spilled over from our politics. And I think there's a way in which that's true. What this book tries to draw our attention to is not the spillover from our politics into our personal lives, but the ways in which the habits of our own hearts have actually spilled out over into our politics. And that creates a vicious feedback loop in which our politicians are acting in ways to appeal to the desires of our own hearts. And then we're voting and affirming their playing to our desire for anger, for fear, and that reinforces a sick system that needs to be broken out of.
You know, it's funny, as you were talking, I was thinking about an illustration in my undergraduate days in psychology, where there was a discussion or experiment. I got to verify whether this actually happened or not, but the illustration is helpful anyway.
Yes.
Is that the professor was talking about this experiment that was done on subtle negative or subtle reinforcement. So there was an experiment on the professor where the class, whenever he moved to the left, they would nod their head ever so slightly. Whenever he moved to the right, they would shake their head like this. And he ended up pinned in the corner, didn't know why he was there and wouldn't move. And largely because everyone was giving them these subtle cues. Now, that isn't to say that our politicians don't bear moral responsibility for the reactions they have, but I think there is a human nature, and this is one of the things I think the gospel speaks to so credibly, is there is a human nature, there's a sinful condition we find ourselves in where we are autonomy seekers. We don't want to be with God. We want to be him. Yeah. And there is a soul sickness that attends to that kind of a thing. And you're going to see it reflected throughout all of creation and throughout all of human institutions, including our politicians as well. But they are going to react to the way in which we give them the subtle cues, I should say, as to, if you do this, I will vote for you.
Yeah.
We're in this politics as entertainment thing. There's a lot of media responsibility for that as well. But I think that this is something really important for us to understand in terms of our social engagement and spiritual formation, which is something you also talk quite a bit about in the book, is this importance of spiritual formation. Now, look, our ministry, our what we do is, as an apologetics ministry, we're primarily evangelists. We want to equip the church, but primarily I would rather speak in a place where there are no Christians every day of the week and twice on Sundays if I could.
Yeah.
Having said that, though, there is a sense in which evangelism happens and does something, but then people think that's the end of the game, as opposed to there's something else in there, which is discipleship. But there's sort of this feedback loop, which can be positive, which is if you evangelize properly and you do it through proper discipleship so that the followers of Christ become more attractive, then you'll evangelize better, which leads to better discipleship, which leads to better evangelism. So you talk a lot about spiritual formation in your book as well, and I'd love you to sort of expand on that a little more.
Yeah. Well, right. And, we could maybe get into this, right? We aren't trying to win people to a decision. We're trying to win people to a life. And so we're evangelizing toward a vision for fullness in the life with Jesus. And so formation is inherently a part of that. Formation, so a couple just important things, which I'm assuming many of your listeners will already know and appreciate, but everyone has a spiritual formation. You do not choose to have a spiritual formation. Spiritual formation is just that process by which the human character will takes on a particular kind of shape.
Yes.
Christian spiritual formation is relentlessly centered on and focused on Jesus Christ. Paul refers it, I've been spending a lot of time in Colossians 3 this year in particular. It says you have taken off the old self with its practices and put on the new self, which is being renewed in the image of the knowledge of its creator. That is a powerful image. And I think that we've often treated formation as like the costly and burdensome end of a trade for which we get like eternal life after we die. But that is not what is suggested in the Gospels. That's not what Jesus has on offer. I was, sometimes when you've read certain passages of Scripture that never hit you, and then finally you do, and it does. There's this passage in 1 John 5 where you think, why hasn't anyone said this before? And that's like, oh, it's A, like a lot of people have said it before. B, it's like right there in Scripture where in 1 John 5, it's like this is not the hard part. Like this is not the sacrifice. The burdensome part is trying to live without Jesus. But I think so often we suggest to people that really they are better off. It's much easier not trying to follow Jesus, but we're doing it because like we're trying to get to heaven, or we're doing it because we're particularly valorous. Jesus has the best life on offer, and I'd encourage everyone to take him up on his offer. It's the best thing that you could do for your life. And so, spiritual formation is, Dallas Willard believes spiritual formation of any kind took place through what he called VIM, vision, intention, and means. So you're captured by a vision for life. You make an intention to live into that vision, to do what is required to acknowledge that reality, and then you take up the immediate means available to do so. And that's so much of the Christian life is yes, the vision, yes, the intention, but also like what do we do once we have once we come to believe that this kind of life is possible, and what kind of invitation does Jesus have for us?
Yeah. From an apologetics value, I want to just go a little bit further on what you just said, because I don't want to apply it to a phenomenon you talk about in the book as well, and I've noticed quite a bit, which is from apologetics value. I think one of the biggest things going on right now in terms of the credibility of the Christian faith and its lack thereof with young people, because I think from the Pew Research Forum to everybody else who's talking about this, young people are distrustful of all institutions, including, maybe not especially, but including religious institutions of all varieties. And so that distrust, I think, is a result. I think that we are in a post-trust world because we are in a post-truth world, and which leads to confirmation bias run amok, and all these kind of things we've already talked about.
Yes.
But one of the things that I think about from an apologetic standpoint is, I think young people are not necessarily asking primarily, is the Bible true or is Christianity true? They're asking, is it good?
Mm.
Because there is a strong sense of moral value attached to, there's a strong sense of cause and morality and authenticity in whether it's the younger end of millennials into Gen Z and into Gen Alpha.
Yeah.
There's a lot of sense of morality to these things. So is it good? Is there a question? If you tell them Jesus rose from the dead as an historical fact, and here's 5 reasons why I believe that, or you give them science and faith are not antithetical, here's why I believe that. One of the people that you blew my mind at the inaugural summit was Rosalind Picard, and I had the pleasure of meeting her when I was speaking at MIT very recently, and she further impressed me. And here's someone who's brilliant, who's a scientist, and who sees no incompatibility between her faith and what she does for a living. In fact, well, the one inspires the other. All of that.
Yes.
They still ask, is it good? And it's the primary question because it seems so not very good. And I think what's happened, and you've spoken to this a bit too, is on the right, however you define that, on the right are people who were so concerned that people are using social justice or social issues as a works-based system to get to heaven, that they heavily emphasized the faith part. Then there were those who were saying, you're not at all talking about how Jesus would act and treat people of certain echelons of society or whatever it is. And so you're jettisoning the whole thing. So the one becomes suspicious of the other as being theologically liberal. The other becomes suspicious of the right as being socially oblivious, or they don't care, or even immoral. And now they've started to immoralize each other.
Yeah.
This is that whole misplaced moralization thing. So that phenomenon, when I wrote More Than a White Man's Religion, I was coming to ask the question, how did Christianity become viewed in the West as a white man's religion when the vast majority of Christians are not white and are not men?
Right.
How did that happen? And I think that's part of the explanation.
Yes.
Anyway, so that is a part of the spiritual formation. I think this is fully orbed. We both think that the other one's missing something, but we also are not willing to look at what it is we're missing.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, Willard referred to these as gospels of sin management. And I think it's an apt diagnosis. But this idea of the present availability of the kingdom of God, it is one that I find to be quite powerful and evident in the Gospels and evident in the life that I'm living and trying to live more and more of each day. So I'll say that. I think the other thing, to say that Christianity is for the good is not to say that everyone will receive it as good. And in the political context, this is really important to understand. It is not that if we were positioning ourselves in the right way, then everyone would acknowledge how wonderful we are and how wonderful that's not what this is about. This is about, though, is what is the intention of the Christian in public life? As you know, I think we need to be wary of making broad, categorical, doctrinal statements about how Christianity applies specifically in politics. One statement I'm fairly comfortable making is that if a Christian's politics is not intended toward the good of their neighbors, toward the good of society, toward the good of even their enemies, their politics is not Christian in its character. And when it is, everybody benefits. Now, that doesn't speak to, we could have all kinds of prudential, practical agreements about, well, what is for the good? Mm-hmm. But so much of what Jesus is concerned about is the orientation of the heart, mm-hmm. the intent of the heart. That's what, I always find it striking. In Acts 8, Simon is rebuked not for offering the bribe, not for offering the payment so that he could lay on hands and perform miracles, but for the intent of his heart. And that is often the thing by which we're condemned, not voting the wrong way, not these intellectual analyses, but what are we aiming for?
Yeah. Boy, the Gospels, the Bible from start to finish is rife with this kind of thing exactly, Michael, where We have this, you know what the law says, but you don't know its power. You don't know its spirit. You don't know its intent.
Yeah, yeah.
And this goes, and without being doom and gloom, I just think this is something we need to make sure we can pause for a moment's self-reflection. And I think this helps with being the ambassador for Christ. This helps with the apologetic value of this Christian message, is that when you self-reflect and then conform your character based on the deficiencies you see as God leads, and you pray and you think these things through, we can have a higher level of credibility, because the message already has its own credibility, but the messengers don't always have that credibility. And I've often said it is that the credibility of a message is often judged by the integrity of the messenger. Now, logically speaking, that's not true. Liars can say true things. They do it all the time.
Yeah.
But the reality is people judge the integrity, the credibility of the message based on the integrity of the messenger. Doesn't mean you have to be perfect. It doesn't mean you have to be flawless. It just means you have to have, I think, some level of introspection and self-reflection to be able to say, where have I fallen short and where have I been a stumbling block to various people, whether you're on this side or that side or right in the middle as well. I think this is a terribly important thing for the purposes of making sure that this message is, because it's intellectually credible, it's historically robust, it's scientifically verifiable, it's all these things. And I don't want to make overstatements on these things, but there's so much to it. But sometimes we get in the way of the thing we want to do.
Yeah.
Which is profess the credibility of it. And I think that that's so important. I know I've gotten in the way. I know that.
Yes.
I just have to make sure I can hone that again and again. And I think with this book, The Spirit of Our Politics, you've really helped us to do that. There is a bit of a soul sickness, but it's not new.
Yeah.
It's as old as human beings.
Yes.
So I just want to say, again, without being overly gushing, I do want to say you've done us a favor with
I
this book.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, I do want to, before we, I know we're short on time, but I wanted to, before we wrap up, I was wondering, Michael, if you could talk about the Center for Christianity and Public Life a little bit. Just let people know what you're doing there, what the aims of your nonprofit is, because, we want people to go and check that out in case there's anyone from our listeners who haven't heard that, because this is really important work.
I so appreciate it. So we publicly launched in 2022 with the mission to contend for the credibility of Christian resources in public life for the public good. And the Center for Christianity and Public Life advances that mission through basically two streams of work. Christian civic formation. We're seeking to grow, resource, convene, represent the community of Christians who are convinced that spiritual formation is central to civic renewal. And so we run a fellowship program. We run a community of young professionals. We run a program for Christian high school students. We run private retreats for civic leaders. And then that stream is complementary to our public imagination work, where we seek to explain Christianity to the public and advance Christian resources for the good of the public. And our summit, our annual summit, which takes place in 2025, I believe October 20th and 21st, is one way of advancing that work. This book is another expression of our public imagination stream, and folks can learn more about the center at ccpubliclife.org. We'd love to have you engage. We'd love to serve you and resource you, and really appreciate the opportunity to share about that work.
Yeah, we'll drop a link down below to all that, dude. I love that focus on just the imagination and just remembering keeping the right story in front of us.
Yes.
Because there's so many bad versions of that story that we can tell ourselves, and then we start to be suspicious of our neighbor rather than love God and our neighbors. So I appreciate that. Thank you, Michael. And thank you for being here today. This was great.
I so appreciate your work and really grateful for you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much.
Abdu, would you like to hit us with some, we didn't really argue, but I guess you can have a closing argument just to
closing statement. I'll just do a closing statement.
Be a gimmick of the show for me.
Yeah, it is the conceit of the show to do a law thing based on my background. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, obviously you've heard something that I hope will not convict your opponent, but convict you. And a constant reflection on my own attitude and helps me to convict myself. We have to, that spiritual formation is about the molding of who we are to the image of Christ and what he would have us do. And you look to his word, you look to his example, you look to his life, and you'll see that. I do think that the important thing to remember is that, one, the politics we have is the politics we asked for. And that is, again, an introspection to one another. As evidence, I would have you take a look at Michael Weir's book, The Spirit of Our Politics. As further evidence, I would ask you to attend the CCPL summits. You won't agree with everything everyone says. That is exactly why you should go. I didn't when I first went, and there's a lot I did agree with, and there's some I didn't, but that's exactly why I should go, because the discussions are presented thoughtfully. You will be benefited. So engage your mind, engage your spirit in the word, engage your mind in opposing views, and engage your mind in a way that goes back to the beginning of this thing. You can be of the same faith and different politics, but there is unity there. And if we find ourselves engaging in unity because of our joint politics as opposed to our joint faith, we need to rethink how we think about our politics. The guest has been Michael Weir. His book has been and is The Spirit of Our Politics, and he's the founder of the Center for Christianity and Public Life. Check them all out at the links below. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, until next time, the defense rests.